The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, 6 Key Steps to Standards-Based Learning. My name is Joe Granda, and I'm from TeacherEase. I'll be the host for today's webinar. Welcome to the TeacherEase webinar series. This series spotlights and shares best practices, success stories, and the latest research for standards-based learning community. Before we get started, I would like to review a couple of logistics. All of the phone lines are on mute to prevent background noise from interfering with the webinar during the session. If you wish to communicate with the presenters or myself, please enter any questions in the dialog question box that you'll find with Citrix. We will save your questions about the presentation for the end during our Q&A session. That Q&A will be about 10 to 15 minutes. The duration of the presentation itself for the webinar is approximately 45 minutes. After the webinar, we will provide a link to the recording for today's presentation, as well as the slides. Now let's kick off the webinar, 6 Key Steps to Standards-Based Learning. So let's start off with a poll. What I'd like to do is try to understand, where are you in terms of standards-based grading? Does your school district use standards-based grading? So if you could, check in there. The first option is yes, you have implemented standards-based grading. Second is currently implementing standards-based grading. The third option is starting to research standards-based grading. And the last one is no, you haven't. So if you could put that in there, I'd like the poll. We've got a good chunk of respondents so far. It's great. We're almost 75% of the folks out there have responded. So I'm gonna close it up in just a second. See how people are answering. Gonna give you 5 more seconds. All right. So now let's share what we learned. So interestingly, we've got a pretty good audience here. So it's 30% that have already put a system in. So hopefully today, what you'll get out of today, you'll get some tips on how to improve your standards-based grading practices. But you also have a bunch of folks that are currently putting it in, and there's a lot of work, and we're going to talk about that. So we'll help you address some of those issues. And again, for those people that are just starting or just haven't done it yet, definitely we'll give you some information to help you out with how to move forward with standards-based grading, whether it is for you. So what I'd like to do is we are back. Should be back at the slides, and I'd like to introduce our speakers. So the first thing I'd like to do is I'm proud to introduce Garnet Hillman. She has served as an instructional coach in Deerfield, Illinois, and as a high school world language instructor in Lockport, Illinois. She's been an educator for 19 years, and in her current role as educational consultant, Garnet enjoys working with schools and educators to improve instruction, assessment, and grading practices. She helps teachers consider the positive impact healthy grading practices and standards-aligned instructional practices have on student learning. She's also the author of Standards-Based Learning in Action and The Grade Cleanse. She's a fantastic resource. We also have Mike Lencioni from TeacherEase. Mike is a former teacher and has a Master's of Science in Data-Driven Education from Johns Hopkins. Mike is a system engineer for TeacherEase, and so we've got a great team of people to share their insights. So with that, I'd like to kick off the webinar. I think we've got a great session ahead for everybody. Again, a reminder, put in your questions in the question dialog box, and we will answer them at the end. Please join me in welcoming Garnet. Here you go, Garnet.
All right. Thanks, Joe. Good morning, everyone. I really appreciate you being able to spend the hour with us this morning. As Joe said, so this is my 19th year in education. I did start off as a world language teacher, and I implemented standards-based learning and standards-based grading for the last few years that I was in the classroom. Once I moved into an instructional coaching position, we were implementing, and then by the time I was done with that role, we had fully implemented standards-based grading. So I've taken a look at it from the individual classroom lens as well as a district-wide lens. So I have a little bit of a varied background with standards-based learning and grading, but it absolutely is my passion. I've seen the positive impact that it's had on students, on their learning, and on their perspective when they come in. As far as TeacherEase, the district where I worked, where we implemented district-wide, they use TeacherEase as their grading platform, and I was able to kind of see it in action in a variety of content areas as well as grade levels. So I do want to mention that switching over to a standards-based system is a process. We're going to talk about 6 steps today, and they're not intended to be taken on all at once. It can be an overwhelming process when it's done that way. So it really is meant to take step by step. For each district, the implementation, of course, is going to look a little bit different, but taking time to do this sets your district up for just a really successful implementation. So it really is a process, not meant to be done all at once. The other thing is that it is a culture shift and a language shift. I know when I implemented, I had to really take a hard look at the language I was using in the classroom and make sure that everything was learning centered. That's why as educators, we get into the business, is that we're all about students and we're all about their learning. But I had moments where I was talking a lot more about grading than I was about learning, and I needed to make sure I set the example that way to develop a culture of learning in my room for the kids, and once I switched to that coaching role, to support the teachers to develop that culture. All right, Joe, let's go to the next slide. So some key ideas we're going to walk through today. The behaviors are going to be removed from the academic grade, and they need to be reported separately. We understand they're both important, but if we're looking for clear communication, that's a very important idea that we need to implement. Secondly, that all assessment, your assignments, instruction, practice that the kids do has to be aligned to your standards, has to be aligned to your learning targets. We'll talk a little bit about standards and learning targets and how to make those work really well in classrooms and schools. The grades are going to have to be based on evidence of learning with those standards, and we can't be looking at things like norm referencing, and we'll expand upon that. Like I mentioned, the focus has to be on learning, and grades shift to the background. And what I always told my kids was, when the learning happens, the grades will follow. So if we really focus on learning, the grades will be there. We don't have to really worry about that, because I think for some of our students, grades become a little bit of a stressful thing, and they can worry a lot about them. So helping them calm down and really focus on the learning, that really shifted the culture in my classroom. And then the shortened proficiency scale, and we'll dive in to the traditional percentage scale versus a more standards-based scale to see the differences and to see the benefit of shifting to the proficiency, which is a lot less levels. Next slide, please. Establishing a purpose statement for grading is essential for a school or a district. And so this is my purpose statement. It kind of morphs and changes as I go along, but currently the purpose of grading to me is to simply communicate where a student is in relation to those standards at a given moment in time. And so I think it's really important to center on the word communicate. Grades are about communication. They're not about earning. They're not used as a punishment. They're not used as any kind of reward. What we're trying to do is communicate something, whether we use numbers or letters to do that. We're trying to say something with those. And it's where the student is in relation to those standards. So like I mentioned before, alignment is essential. And it's at a given moment in time. We have marking periods, whether they be quarters, trimesters, or semesters. And so it's that communication at that moment. Here are our standards. Here's where the evidence of learning is right at this point, whether it be 9 weeks or some other time period. Next slide. There are some things in a standards-based system that are going to need to shift. And these are some things that in traditional settings usually show up. And in the beginning of my teaching career, they definitely were a part of my classroom until I started learning a little bit more about standards-based systems, learning, and grading. So averaging previous with most recent evidence. We want to make sure that we're reporting where the kids end with their learning and not combining with where they started. If we start looking at things like, I'm going to average, their beginning scores, let's say on some formative work, with where they end, we could have inaccurate reporting. And if the goal of switching to a standards-based system and our purpose for grading is to communicate where they are right now, we can't average with where they started. Another thing to remember with the averaging is that we want to make sure that we keep motivating our kids to learn. And sometimes if they start off really slowly and they know that's going to get averaged in, it works against that motivation to learn. But if they know a slow start is all right, as long as they keep moving forward, that can really support our kids. They want to know always that they can. Extra credit is another thing that just isn't necessary once a standards-based system is in place. I know I used extra credit and it was very well intentioned. I wanted my kids to be able to recover if maybe they had a bad day or something went wrong on an assessment. But with the standards-based system, you're incorporating things like reassessment. So instead of making something extra or something different, what you do is give the kids a chance to go ahead and do some further learning and some reassessment. And then we don't need to use those. They're not essential for a standards-based system. Behavioral grading, like I mentioned, it's going to have to be separate from the academic achievement for clear communication. So it's not that we wouldn't keep track of some behaviors, work with our students to improve them, do some teaching on this side of things, but it will need to be separated out. Inappropriate assessment, all I'm referring to here is that we want to make sure we're assessing the standards. I know in my practice that until I really took a close look and did some analysis, I had some assessments that really weren't addressing the standards, and those had to go or they had to change. Curving grades or norm referencing isn't clear communication. All it is communicating is where one child is in relation to another child rather than where the student is in relation to the standards. Unrecoverable zeros. Zeros can be used or they don't have to be used in standards-based systems. The key here is that a student needs to be able to recover. If they have some formative work that is essential and maybe it's not completed in a timely fashion, they're going to need to be able to recover from that. So those are some practices that typically show up in traditional systems. And like I said, I know they showed up in mine that really had to go and take a different look at what was happening. Next slide, please. So the 6 key steps that we're going to walk through today. First would be the analysis of behavioral grading. What is actually going into that grade that might need to move into the behavioral side? Determining the standards. What are our standards? Which ones are our priorities? Once you have them, you got to unpack them into some learning targets. I'll show you a couple different ways. There are many, many ways to unpack standards, but I'll show you 2 different ways that are pretty common. The 4th step is then to get into assessment, formative assessment, summative assessment, being clear about the intention for each one of those, and feedback. Feedback is essential to learning. Step 5, then we get into proficiency levels and how we're going to determine those to be able to, again, accurately communicate where they are with their learning. And finally, we'll talk about record keeping, communication, and how to do that in a standards-based system.
Garnet,
next slide.
Before we go to the next slide, why don't we do the poll? We definitely want to see where everybody sits.
Yes, let's do that. Thanks, Joe.
No problem, no problem. because I think this will be interesting, gang. We've got a poll, and the question here is, what stage of the implementation is your district with standards-based grading? So if you can check to see where are you, because definitely will help us understand our audience. So have you set your learning targets and rubrics for your standards? Are you building assessments to match curriculum? Have you done your curriculum mapping and lesson planning? Have you done all of those things and set up a gradebook to track where you are by standards? And hopefully you're not doing it with averages. And then the last one is, are you creating standards-based report cards to communicate where they are? So we're doing pretty good. We got about half the folks that have answered this question. I'll give it just another 15 seconds to see where people are in the process. It's very interesting. A lot of people have done some really good work, it looks like. Okay, I'm going to close the poll and share it. And so what did we see? So, we've got a chunk of folks, 60%, essentially 59% that have set up the learning targets, and then building their assessments, follow their. I think it's interesting. You got 70% that have curriculum mapping, and I guess the key is, have you done curriculum mapping and lesson planning that is standards-based grading centric, right? And then we got some folks that have grade books, and then it's interesting. We've got 43% with the grade books, but a lot of you are doing report cards without a grade book tool. So I'm sure there's a little bit extra work involved with that. So interesting stuff. Thank you for your feedback, gang. And I'm going to give it back to Garnet, but thank you for the feedback. It's all yours, Garnet.
Great. If you go to the next slide. So step one is that analysis of behavioral grading. And I know in my practice, when I first started considering this, I didn't think I had very many behaviors in my grades, but the more I looked, the more I found things like participation were going into that. And again, I want to stress, it's not that participation or other behaviors like that aren't important, but when they go in with the grade, we have a little bit of muddying of the waters, if you will, as far as communication. We're not quite as clear. Next slide, please. So there are many behaviors that can impact accuracy in grading, and here are a few. I think timeliness is a big one. We want students to learn how to be timely with their work. We know that this is an essential life skill. We know they're going to need to be able to do it when they leave us, whether they go straight into the workforce, college, university, trade school, military, anything like that. We know timeliness is important. So again, we're going to teach it. We may feel that we want to report on it, but if we put it in there, if a student, for example, turns in something late, and let's give an example of maybe a letter grade down for being late with the work, if it was a paper and they're a really strong writer and they're able to show that, we aren't clearly communicating potentially by saying it was a B when all the problem was is that they turned it in late. Completion grades, I did these, and I think it comes out of a really good place because completion grades usually happen because we don't want to penalize a student for making a mistake, especially early on in their learning. But again, it impacts the accuracy because if we're just talking about giving points for getting something done, it may not be communicating that they are truly proficient with a standard or with a learning target. I mentioned participation. Effort, I think, is really difficult to tell how much effort students are putting forward because it looks different from student to student or from child to child. Compliance with rules and different expectations, whether it be in the classroom context or whether that be with expectations on a project or something like that. And it's not that we don't have them. We have classroom expectations, we have rules, we have expectations on particular assignments. But if those aren't followed, if it's behavioral, we take care of it on that side. If it's academics and I had an expectation on some type of project, the student didn't get a proficiency level until the expectation was met. For example, it would be like using a checklist for a project. And if the things on the checklist weren't done, then I wasn't going to give the student a proficiency level. So it's two different things. Checklists and, for example, like a rubric, which we'll mention, can be used together, where the checklist are the requirements or the expectations for the students. Once those are fulfilled, then you can look at a rubric, which is really going to talk about the quality of the work. But if it's simply the expectations, we're not looking at proficiency. With cooperation, I'm talking about group work. Again, we know what an important skill this is. Students are going to have to be able to work with one another, but it is behavioral. It doesn't necessarily speak to the academic standards. With exception, sometimes physical education standards include these. There are at times where music and things like that may include these. If cooperation with others is part of the academic standards that you're working with, then it gets reported on the academic side. What I'm talking about is when we don't have an academic standard that applies with cooperation. Next slide, please. So I want to stress that they are equally important. But if they go together into a grade, then we have inaccurate communication. It's just that both facets need to be on there. And those of you that are starting with that standards-based reporting or who are looking to start with standards-based reporting, these need to both be on there so that parents can get the whole picture, students can get the whole picture of what's going on in the classroom. And then it really supports growth in both areas because they can see it. Next slide, please. Because here's what can happen with a single letter grade that incorporates both. For this particular student, a letter grade of a C could mean a variety of things in a traditional grading setting. A C could mean proficiency with the standards, but maybe the work was coming in late quite often, or maybe formative work was not turned in. It could also mean that the behaviors as far as turning things in, being timely, putting forth effort are there, but the proficiency may not be. And we want to make sure that we're communicating accurately. We could do this with any letter. Any letter could mean a variety of things in a traditional setting. So we want to make sure with the academic side of things, it's proficiency with the standards. And with the behavioral side of things, any behaviors that are identified for reporting, that we report proficiency or many times frequency with those. Next slide, please. So step 2 is determining the standards. You can go to the next slide while I talk about this a little bit. For many of us, the standards are determined, but it's essential that we get to know them really, really well. For many of us, we use things like the Common Core standards for ELA and math, next generation science standards, the 3 C's for social studies. We also have state standards for things. I know that for something like physical education, it usually is state standards or national standards. Sometimes it's standards from national organizations. I was a world language teacher, and so sometimes standards for that are pulled from ACTFL, which is our national organization. So we need to determine where they're coming from, and we need to get to know them really, really well. We also need to remember that our understanding of the standards will grow from year to year. We need to keep coming back to them. Learning about the standards is never done, just like learning for our students is never done. Next slide, please. This is essential. We cannot summatively assess all of the standards for our grade level or subject matter. There are too many. Most of these things have, like language arts could have 60 standards, and we can't be summatively assessing. I know a lot of times as teachers, we feel like we're assessing quite often as it is. So we need to prioritize standards. Not all standards are equally as important as others. So which ones are essential for our students to master by the end of the year? And you can look at a variety of things for that. You can look for a standard that comes back many times in the year. You can look for skills that cross over into other content areas. You can look at ones that are of high need for your students. But you're going to end up with prioritized standards. Some people refer to them as power standards. And then you'll have supporting standards. What's key here is that all the standards will be taught and practiced, but the priority standards or the power standards will be summatively assessed, whereas our supporting standards are going to be in the formative realm because they support. So we'll work with those, we'll formatively assess those so that our students, when we get to those power standards, they have the background that they need to really be able to develop mastery. Next slide, please. So analyze them as well. Once you have those priority standards determined, we need to think about what they demand from the students. And we need to talk with our colleagues about this because we can develop inter-rater reliability this way. Whereas if we don't have a clear understanding of the standards, different things could be going on across the hall with the same course with a different teacher. So once the work is done of prioritizing those standards, we really need to talk about what they demand. What are our students going to have to do to prove proficiency? Next slide, please. So the third step, once those are established, which ones we're going to summatively assess, it's time to take a look at deconstructing them or unpacking them for our students, because standards tend to be very robust and very broad, and they need something a little bit more granular to support their understanding and for us to support formative practice, our instruction, our formative assessment for the students. Next slide, please. I'm going to show you two different ways to unpack standards. And the first one is the KUD. So the K stands for know. These are the facts, the pieces of information that we want students to know. So it could be things like vocabulary development. It could be things in social studies, for example, different facts, pieces of information they need to know. I think on the know side, it is important to determine what students need at their fingertips versus what it's okay if they look up. Because when we are going to unpack a standard, if we want to go with some learning targets about what they need to know, these are the things that we want them to have at their fingertips. We want them to be able to access, because we know we live in a digital world, we want them to be able to access them without using some type of device or another type of resource. The U stands for understand. And if any of you have ever worked with essential questions, it's that kind of work where you would develop statements that are broad and address understandings the students are going to need to be able to show you. When you get to the do, these are your skills that the kids are going to have to demonstrate. So what these do to work together is that the students are going to need the knowledge when they show their skills, and then they're also going to show what they understand. So what we show on the slide there is that it's the facts and info with our skill-based that really show their deeper understanding. Personally, this is the way that I unpack standards for my students. I had no standard or learning targets, excuse me. I had do learning targets, and then I had a couple of big understandings that they needed to show. Those understand statements, it's essential that they understand that and that they can be responded to in a variety of ways. And the know, understand, and do statements are based on the work of Carol Tomlinson and her work with differentiation, if you'd like to dig in more deeply with that. Next slide, please. One of the most common ways to unpack standards is to simply use I can statements. They're very user-friendly. We know that they're very positive language, and that's important for our students, that they always feel that if they're not there, that they're not there yet. So these I can statements are really nice for that. They support that idea of you will be able to do this. They're very similar to the do statements from the KUD. So if you like that format, you could certainly start your do learning targets with I can. Many times these are set up in a progression so the students can see where they are starting with some of the more simple learning targets all the way up to the more complex when they're developing mastery and are really going to get to that point where they can show you the standard in sum. And those skills, whether you unpack them with KUD, these kind of I can statements, any style of learning target, these guide the formative practice and the formative assessment process for you and for the kids. Next slide, please.
It's my turn now, Garnet. I get to kick a little bit off with TeacherEase. TeacherEase software, it tackles the challenges for standards-based learning. We offer a comprehensive platform that covers learning targets and rubrics to gradebooks to analytics to report cards for standards-based grading. Now, Mike Lencioni, he's going to provide a brief demo highlighting just a small portion of these capabilities. In particular, he'll show you the new starter kit for teams and organizations collaborating on setting learning targets and rubrics. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Michael. Let me change the controls here, and Mike will be able to share his screen. Michael, it's yours.
Awesome, thank you, Joe. So as Joe mentioned, what I'm going to show you today is our standards-based learning, or SBL starter pack. It's really designed for schools making the transition to SBL. When schools begin the transition and prepare to unpack standards, one of the first steps we see them take is forming committees, or a select group of admin and instructors that will work on each course. This could be your professional learning community, or PLC, in the case of a 5th grade course, or a subset of the members of a department in the case of an Algebra 1 course. Once the school decides who will work on which course, they can add that to TeacherEase on the Committees tab. When I look at my 5th grade math course, I can navigate to the Committees tab and see that the 5th grade PLC is assigned. I can see that they're going to work on this 5th grade math course, but also the 5th grade ELA course. And then I can see the instructors listed below. Once the committee is set up, they can start breaking down the standards into learning targets. In this view, they can see the standards down the side and places for learning targets next to those. This course is using Common Core 5th grade math standards, and then breaking them down into one or even multiple targets. And you'll see that some of the standards are not being used at all. When I want to create a learning target, I click Create, and I can add that to the system. Now, as one instructor works through the list and makes changes, the other members of the committee are updated. I'll tunnel in and show you what the other instructors see. So when I'm in as another instructor, and they navigate to Tools, My Committees, they can see the committees to which they're assigned. And they can see that for 5th grade math, there have been 20 changes since they last viewed the targets. Clicking Unseen Changes will show these in a side-by-side view with the last version this instructor saw on the left and the new version on the right. The key at the top highlights the different types of changes. So whether a new target was added or removed or modified or moved, that's highlighted right there, easy for the instructor to see. Now, if the instructor wants to make further updates, they can navigate back and view the actual targets. And then from here, they can make their changes, which will update the other members of the committee. They can also make comments on the changes, so it becomes a discussion instead of a list of changes. And throughout the process, the system preserves a version history that can be referenced, so you can see all the changes you've made over time. If at any point the committee needs some inspiration, they can use the search tool. Searching by subject, grade level, or even standard, they can see the targets that other schools have built within our system, helping them foster a shared community of resources and knowledge. Right now, this works for learning targets, but we'll be adding rubrics and report cards to this shortly as well. Once the committee is happy with their targets, they have the foundation for the steps to come next. They can build rubrics, create assessments, report cards, and even start working in the gradebook. Rubrics, which use the same committee structure, can be easily edited for each target, breaking down the learning progression into clear steps. Within TeacherEase, the rubric can be used to score assignments as well as for students' self-assessment. When a student completes their work, they can go right in and say self-assess. They'll see the rubric here with the targets on the left. They can enter for where they think they are on each of the different targets and submit this to the instructor. Once the instructor logs in, they can go right to their gradebook, click on the assignment, and see the feedback that the student submitted. The instructors then have the ability to score this assignment and give some great feedback. That feedback this fosters the communication that is essential for learning. Again, the starter pack is the first portion of a full standards-based learning solution in TeacherEase. It provides a foundation for your SBL house. Using the starter pack allows your implementation to naturally flow from setup to implementation. Since all of the UNPACK standards are in TeacherEase, you don't have to worry about migrating your foundation to a disparate system. It's all there already, allowing you to keep up the momentum you've achieved with your team. Thank you for your time, and now I'll hand it back to Garnet.
All right, while we get the screen loaded, thanks, Mike. So we'll be moving into the assessment realm now and talking about summative assessment and formative assessment and that feedback piece, which is really the essential piece to learning. Next slide, please. So it's important to establish the difference between formative and summative assessment. And two questions to ask when determining this would be how your data or your evidence is used. The information that you get from the assessment, what do you do with it? Is it used to move learning forward, where you're going to be making some instructional and some practice decisions? Or is it going to be used to go ahead and make a judgment of proficiency level? So of course, if it's looking forward and making some decisions according to the evidence, that's going to be formative. And when we're going to make a judgment about proficiency, that's summative. I think it's important too to make sure that we're looking at assessment as a process and not as just a singular event. We're looking at the formative process and the summative process for making a determination of proficiency level. So it's a little shift in language from maybe what was previously used in a traditional system. The other consideration is the assessment connected to just a learning target, or is it the entire standard? Is it encompassing that robust standard and asking them to demonstrate that skill as a whole instead of broken down into the pieces? The formative side of things would be the learning targets, and the summative would be the standard. So as important as it is to deconstruct or to unpack the standards, it's very important that when we summatively assess our students that we've put those pieces back together and ask them to demonstrate the entire skill. Next slide, please. For summative assessment, it can address one standard, but of course it can address multiple standards as well. They really take on a variety of forms. There is a place for a traditional test or a traditional quiz. Of course, essays, projects, speeches, any type of presentation, all fulfill the summative assessment realm. It's really not the task type that we need to consider. It really goes back to that intention of how we're going to use the evidence and making sure that it addresses the entire standard. Summative assessment, they don't have to be lengthy. They can be shorter. It depends on if you're going to be addressing one standard or multiple standards many times. And really, the length of the summative assessment is determined by how much evidence you need from the students to prove proficiency. So when you're having that discussion with your colleagues about what proficiency looks like and what the standard demands of the students, that should lend itself forward then to planning summative assessment and really how long it needs to be. If you need 4 questions on more of a traditional test to get the idea of whether they are proficient or not, then that's all you need. For many teachers, traditional tests used to be much longer. The nice part about this is if you have a test that is standards aligned and it's pretty lengthy, you may actually already have a reassessment tool if you divide up those questions. So of course it must give ample opportunity for the kids to show proficiency, but we don't need them to keep proving it over and over and over again. Just enough for us to really get a clear picture. Next slide. Formative is going to be clearly connected to that learning target. Again, alignment is so important. Part of developing relevance for our students and developing engagement is that they can see the tie to the learning target with the eventual tie to the standard. Formative assessment typically is not graded, or if it is assigned a proficiency level, it's not included in the final academic grade, because this is the process by which the students are learning. These are the check-in points. It needs to feed that learning forward, and it's important to remember that it shouldn't just inform you, but it should inform the students. If we've clearly communicated what those standards mean to students and our learning targets, when they get some result or they get some evidence from a formative assessment, they should be able to see where they are on their journey. And so they're able to use some of the self-assessment tools and things like that. And feedback. Formative assessment has got to be accompanied by feedback. Next slide, please. If we think about any other type of learning, maybe sports, for example, outside of our school realm, feedback is so, so important, and it is for our kids in school as well. Something like an athlete. I know, for example, I was a gymnast. There was no way I was going to move forward and make progress unless I had feedback, whether it was feedback that I got by missing a landing on something or feedback I got from my coaches. So teachers serve that role with academics, and feedback is something that we really need to focus on. And on the next slide, if you'll go, these are some characteristics of quality feedback. It does need to be specific. I know there are times when students are making some mistakes with potentially multiple learning targets or multiple facets of a particular assignment, but we need to be very specific with our feedback. Provide a starting place for students. Because if there's a lot of feedback, maybe all over a paper, for example, or all over a digital document, the student will get lost with where to begin. So we can start with one learning target, for example, and then move to the next. We won't ignore any of the missing pieces for the student, but we do need to provide them a starting place. It should identify not only those next steps, but we need to have an area of strength. What's going well? Again, this feeds into that motivation for students to keep going with their learning. It needs to be timely, which at some times means immediate. Other times, a little delay would actually be beneficial to the student. Think about a scenario when maybe the student is doing some formative work in class and you're able to take a look at it and they're close and you think the student will be able to figure out what's going on their own. That's the time to just give it a moment and see if they can do that. I always like to say, don't put the superhero cape on quite yet and jump in. There are other times when maybe a misconception is pretty large, and that means for timely feedback, we need to do it immediately. And then, of course, the feedback needs to be actionable for the students. We want to avoid correcting the students all the time. That places the work with the brunt of the work with the teacher, and we want the brunt of the work to be with the students. So maybe they need an example of how to correct a mistake or how to move forward in their learning, but then we turn the reins over to the students and let them take action. Next slide, please. Proficiency levels then would be next. If we have evidence and we get to the summative realm and we get that, we need to talk about what to do with it. You can go to the next slide. So 4 levels in a standards-based system is the most common, but 2 to 7 is manageable. I really would try not to go over 7 because each level must be able to describe the learning. Rubrics should then mirror those levels. So if you're on a standards-based system with 4 levels, then of course the rubric should mirror that. That makes it very easy for eventually putting things into the grade book if you're doing that with those rubrics. And then the proficiency levels, of course, get used for reporting. But it is essential that each level has to have a descriptor. And if we're going down to the standard level for proficiency, you have to be able to describe the learning. So if we start to go beyond 7 levels, it's really difficult to describe what learning looks like beyond that. Next slide, please. So what about the percentage scale? Traditional systems, as we know, typically use percentage scales. The problem with these is that they provide 101 levels of learning. And if we go back to what I just said about being able to describe them, I don't think I could describe 101 levels of learning for a standard. The other issue with percentage scales is that they are heavily weighted toward the letter grade category of F. And if we have from, let's say, a 59 all the way down to a 0 for an F, as we know, if a student gets one of the lower levels on that scale, let's say a 30%, that can really drop their grade and they will feel like they cannot dig out of the hole. So we want to even the playing field a little bit for the different proficiency levels, or if you're converting to a letter grade for that as well. Next slide, please. So here's an example with some descriptors. There are so many different descriptors for the different levels, no matter how many you'd like to use. But for a 4, you could call it advanced, 3 is proficient, 2 could be developing, 1 could be emerging. And again, there are a large variety out there. The key is with your descriptors, everybody needs to know what they mean. Then you can accurately communicate to those to students as well as parents. So more important than the language you use is that everyone has a clear understanding of what they mean. And that creates that transparency. Next slide, please.
Well, it sounds like
ahead,
this is a perfect time for me to put out another poll. Garnet, what do you think?
That sounds great.
All right, so I got one last poll. It should be a quick one, quick and dirty. So if you can tell us, what are you doing currently for tracking standards-based proficiency? So check all that apply. So you got Excel or Google Sheets, Word, Google Docs. Are you using your SIS or some traditional grade book? Did you go out and get your own standards-based grading-centric grade book? Or none? I know TeacherEase makes a standards-based grade book. Huh. So let's see here. We've got almost half the folks have put in their votes. Give it another 10 seconds. Get a few votes in here. Give it a full minute. Let's see here. So I got 6 seconds to get a minute. All right. Let's see what you all said. So very quickly, we got a bunch of people that are using your SIS. And a handful that are, quarter of you are using an SBG gradebook. Great, good for you guys. And then we got the others. So thank you for the feedback, and it'll give us some context as we go to the next section here, where Garnet's going to talk about record keeping. All yours.
Okay. So the final step gets to record keeping and then communication. If we've done all the brunt work and put in a standards-based system and really determined those proficiency levels against them, we want to be able to effectively communicate that then. So different record keeping things would be important to keep in mind. Next slide, please. Do you see, I see the poll still, Joel. There, perfect, thank you. So our marks are going to be organized by standard rather than task, and I know that showed up in one of the polls earlier, is that you want to make sure that we're not going to simply organize and say test, because that test potentially could have multiple standards and multiple skills tied to it. So we want to make sure they're organized that way. Only that summative evidence is used to determine that level or that grade. You can keep multiple data points, though, for each standard. It doesn't just have to be one moment in time. And not every standard needs to be in the grade book. And I know we mentioned talking about power standards or priority standards, and that's the idea here, is that those are the ones that would go in the grade book. Those are the skills that we need the students to work toward mastery before they leave us and go on to the next grade level or the next course in the series. Next slide, please. So for a standards-based report card, or reporting out this way, academic achievement, their process, which is their behaviors, and their growth would all be reported separately. There's usually a narrative feedback section on what's working, an area for growth. A lot of times this would be where the growth is communicated. But we need to remember we need a balance of information without being overwhelming. Standards-based report cards are going to be longer than a traditional one. A traditional report card has a single letter for every content area or material, if you will, right? Every subject. Whereas this is going to give a little bit more information than that with the skills. But we also don't want a 10-page report card. We know that that's not digestible for students or parents. So it's really seeking that balance of information. Next slide, please. So overall, what's the impact as we start to finish up today? With standards-based system, the focus is centered on learning. What this does is if we move grades to the background and assure students that if the learning is done, the grades will be there, their stress levels go down. I had students tell me this at the high school level, that their stress levels went down when we shifted to a standards-based system. Kids persevere in this system because they know it's not a one and done. And if I don't do well that day, there's no chance to recuperate. There's no chance to recover. Collaboration is valued over competition. It is not a competition for grades. Everyone can achieve proficiency, and all students can find success. We want to communicate over and over again to students that they can, and every single one of you can. Next slide, please. So lastly, I just want to point out a few additional resources, and there are so many wonderful ones out there. These are books. Again, there are articles out there as well if you need a little bit of a shorter read. There are videos out there, so there's all sorts of different ways to get more information about standards-based learning and standards-based grading. And I also run a Twitter chat on the first and third Wednesdays of the month at 8 o'clock Central. So that means tomorrow there is a chat, and we talk about all things standards-based. So it could be a chat on feedback or on assessment or on just the logistics of things. How do we put things in a grade book? What goes in there versus what doesn't? And so my Twitter handle is down there as well. But please feel free to reach out. My email address is on that first slide, and I know that'll be shared, whether it be Twitter or email, if there's anything else I can do to help you on your journey to standards-based learning and standards-based grading.
Thank you, Garnet. That was fantastic. I really appreciate all of your insights. The one thing that I'll say to everybody on the line today is that we've got a great resource in Garnet. We've got her contact details are here on this page. So feel free to reach out to her if your school needs some help in either working on standards-based learning for the first time, or you need to fine-tune and improve your practices. Her consulting services are a great resource for organizations. You also have our contact details here as well. What I'd like to do, let me put you up on here. We're going to open up the Q&A. We've got 7 minutes of Q&A open at this point. So if everybody can kind of chime in here. What I want to remind everybody, we're going to share the recorded link with everybody as well as the slides afterwards. So what I'd like to do is start going through the questions that everybody has from the dialog box, and we may not get to all of them. We probably don't have time to get to all of them, but we'll try to do our best. So the first one here, and I got one for you, Garnet. So the question here is, how can you ensure the students don't blow off formative assessments if they don't get graded? How do you build the intrinsic need? Well, Garnet, you need to take yourself off mute. Can you? There we go.
Sorry. Sorry, took some clicking. We have to make sure that the formative work for students is essential to their learning. Students will blow off work if they don't think that they need to do it. If you have a student that feels that they are already proficient with a standard and then they have formative work to go along with that, we may find that situation. On the flip side of things, we may have students who don't complete work because it might be too difficult for them. So this is where the idea of differentiated instruction comes in. When students see the direct tie between what they're doing in the formative realm and what they're going to have to show in the summative realm, that really supports them in completing work. And if we have students that, need it, but don't want to do it, we know that happens in any kind of grading system. That's our cue as teachers to go ahead and jump in and figure out why that's going on, explain to them how this is absolutely essential and that you need to do it. Holding kids accountable for their work means having them do the work.
Sounds like a plan to me. I definitely would follow that. I've got another question here. Can an administrator start these committees and enter learning target work that has already been done? And so, in the second part of this here, I'm directing this to Michael Lencioni, is there's teachers that can build off of that. So can you help answer that question, Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. The last thing we would want you to do is have to throw away all the work you've done. So we have a series of really simple import tools that our tech services department can help you with. And basically just send us what you have and they can help you import that into the system, and then you can start right from where you are and pick up where you left off right inside TeacherEase.
I have a personal question. I forgot to ask Garnet. Can you share your experience with TeacherEase, Garnet? Do you have any experience with TeacherEase?
Yeah. Like I said in the beginning, when I was working at Deerfield as an instructional coach, they used TeacherEase as their gradebook. And so I was able to work with multiple content areas, grade levels, with them using the gradebook.
Awesome. Here's a question, and it is be both for several of you. Can TeacherEase use custom standards, or only the Common Core standards, or other predetermined standards? So, Marty, do you want to answer that one?
Sure. So what our clients typically like to do is develop standards based upon Common Core standards, or whatever standards they're focusing on, and unpack them, as Garnet had said. And then you can put those standards into TeacherEase and then easily apply those standards to the individual assessments. So that's very key portion of our software. We also have the ability to use out-of-the-box standards if you want to, but the common practice that we've noticed so far is just as Garnet has spoken to, that teachers and professional learning committees create standards and then assign them to courses.
Yeah, and it's important to note that we do have the Common Core ones pre-built in. We also have NGSS pre-built. Any of your state standards are going to be preloaded into the system. So, Common Core is going to be just your ELA and math, but all the range of the different, mandated standards are all in there. But, we do have some instances where, like the Diocese of Madison, for example, is going to use their own standards, and we can bring those into the system as well.
That's a good point, Mike. I can also say, dialing in from Missouri, that we have in Missouri our own standards in Missouri Learning Targets, and different standards in Oklahoma, right? Of course, Illinois, well, it may not be apparent to everyone, but Illinois uses Common Core state standards. So depending upon your state, and of course, it may be different.
Okay. Now, I've got another question here, Garnet, and this one I think is right down your alley here. Perhaps behavior grading is separated by itself, that isn't attached to a learning standard. How do you handle that? And how do you expect students to? How do you communicate that with students to meet the behavioral expectations?
Yeah. So with behavioral expectations, obviously there are many, many behaviors we work with our students on day in and day out. It's important for your staff to determine which of those behaviors you'd like to report on if we're talking about communication. Again, keep that number low. I know there are lots of behaviors, but we can't make ourselves crazy trying to report on 10 behaviors, 15 behaviors. Most commonly I see 3 or 4, no more than 6. But it's important with those to unpack them as well. If we are going to report out on something like work habits and timeliness, what does that mean and what does that look like for students? Because again, when they know what they're shooting for, they're much more likely to hit it. They're going to hit that target. So just as we unpack academic standards, it's important to unpack the behaviors that we expect out of students as well. Then we can report and have it, again, be a meaningful piece of that communication.
Thank you so much. That's great, because we can separate behavioral from academic standards within TeacherEase too. So that definitely is helpful. My last question, the last question of the day, and I thought this one was a good one, was how do high schools with the need for grades on a transcript for colleges How can they be handled?
Well, standards-based systems can be done with letter grades. They work together when they need to. There are definitely schools out there, especially at the elementary, middle school level, that may not need a letter, but if we need to use letter grades, we certainly can. There are a variety of ways to convert from standards-based scores over to letters, and those can be explored by different districts to see what will work best for them. And then you would still have standards-based, standards-aligned assessment and instruction and all of that, yet you would still be able to report a traditional letter grade, convert to GPA, and so on.
Perfect. And Mike, you want to add, you got 30 seconds. You want to add anything to that?
Yeah, we have a couple of really great tools to kind of automate some of that process within TeacherEase and help with that conversion. We do fully support standards-based transcripts. It's something that a lot of the high schools and even some of the middle schools ask us about. So it's built in there. It's really easy to use. Perfect.
Well, again, I want to say thank you so much, Garnet. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Marty. It's been a great webinar. Great feedback, great questions from everybody. We couldn't answer all of your questions, but we do make a promise to everybody that's asked a question that we will follow up with you to answer your questions. So we'll split it up amongst all of us. You will be getting a recording link as well tomorrow, as well as the slides. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day and have a great standards-based learning program. Thanks, guys. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks.